Last lesson we looked at the attempts of realists to update some of the concepts of criminology for a more realistic approach at sociology. We're now going to continue that with our new theory, which attempts to update a lot of the Marxist terminology to make it more realistic, but also make it more appropriate to a more modern and contemporary context. Today we're looking at the approach of radical criminology. So today we're just going to take a look at radical criminology. This essentially is coming from a similar tradition in many ways to the left and the right realists' position, or at least it emerged at the same time, trying to update a lot of the old kind of Marxist views on crime. Often radical criminology is referred to as a kind of neo-Marxist approach. So you can kind of basically call it neo-Marxism in a way, because it takes a lot of concepts from Marxism and seeks to update it by actually combining it with a lot of the, at the time, the recent scholarship on criminology. So combining it with interactionism, kind of creating this joint theory that at the time was kind of really ambitious. It was trying to basically look at all types of crime and kind of be really inclusive in what it can explain. So it is kind of fairly kind of complex, and it does have quite a few factors and depth within it. But if you just start to see it as a kind of mixture between Marxism and interactionism, you kind of begin to see the broad overview. Radical criminology emerged in the 1970s out of a growing dissatisfaction with existing theories, including the more traditional Marxist approaches. It's often referred to as a love child of labelling theory and Marxism, and it's similar to labelling theory in that it does like to focus on the process by which the state and society criminalises certain activities and groups as criminal. But it has quite significant differences from labelling theory, in that it demands a wider focus. It's not just interested in the interaction between police and delinquents, or between the media and delinquents. It's interested in the wider process of criminalisation and why it happens, in relation to the state and its attempt to manage capitalism. So it would see the process of labelling as less some benign process whereby some group or individual is labelled, but actually often a deliberate attempt to manage the capitalist process. An example that we should all be familiar with by now is Stuart Hall's study, Policing the Crisis, in which he argued that the conceptualisation of the black mugger was used to essentially distract people from the challenges that were being faced by the capitalist structure at the time during the Thatcher years. So in brief summary, radical criminologists and neo-Marxists would accept that crime and deviance are part of a social construct, but they would say that this is not simply something which is without motive, and that actually it is done with an almost purposeful attempt to protect and manage capitalism. So that's the broad overview of radical criminology, basically. Marxism plus interactionism equals radical criminology. And what we need now to understand is the main theorist and the main kind of study that we need to support it with, which is essentially Taylor et al. Et al just means and others, because there's a couple of other names, but you can just shorten it to Taylor et al, which just means Taylor and others, just in Latin. For whatever reason, that's just an academic tradition to refer to them like that. So essentially what we're going to do now is look at their kind of big, what he called a big social theory of deviance, trying to explain not only how or what the causes of the crime are in the first place, but also try to explain the reaction. So that's where you're getting the mixture of the Marxism, which would be the crime itself, and the reaction, which would be the interactionist tradition. The main theorists that we associate with radical criminology are Taylor, Walton and Young, who in 1973 outlined a new model which they termed a fully social theory of deviance. Within this model, they outlined 6 factors that have to be considered when discussing crime and deviance in society. First, they argued that we have to examine the wider origins of the deviant act. Crime is not just something which happens because people are bad or evil, as right realism, for example, might suggest. Crime, at least in capitalist societies, is related to inequalities of power, authority, economic ownership, wealth, and so on. Therefore, it's necessary to locate individual behaviour in the cultural context that encourages or discourages certain forms of thinking or behaviour. For example, if we lived in a society that glorified ethnocentric racism or sexism, then these would be more prevalent. So we have to understand the wider origins of the deviant act. Secondly, we have to examine the immediate origins of the deviant act. Just as we need to understand the wider origins, we have to consider everyone's individual circumstances and specific relationships as they commit this particular act of deviance or crime. Therefore, we have to look at exactly how and why people commit that act of crime, both thinking about their personal values, ethics, moral background, but also their social circumstances. So their likely rewards, the possible costs, their socio-economic status, etc. For example, someone living in abject poverty may consider the risks of committing a crime and getting caught fairly low compared to the damages caused by poverty, but they may have very personally held, strong values or ethics that may prevent them from committing the crime. Thirdly, we then need to understand why the criminal individual decided to take that particular action, the actual act involved. We have to get as close as we possibly can to understanding their circumstances when they first committed the crime, and begin to understand why they first chose that deviant act as opposed to the other options available to them. And we also need to consider their perception of their options. Did they actually feel like they had a choice? Okay, so those first factors are actually all related to basically the action itself, and as you'll notice, they're kind of looking more structurally at the issue, trying to think about not only the kind of immediate choices that the individual has. So there's the structure, of course. There is the big capitalist dog-eat-dog stuff that they're bringing from Marxism, encouraging everyone to basically commit crime. But then they also factor in people's individual circumstances, that the dog-eat-dog society that capitalism creates from that Marxist tradition is not going to affect everyone the same way. Everyone will have individual circumstances that will interact with that wider environment. So yes, I may be kind of pushed more towards crime by the wider structure of society, but if I have a strong family unit, if I have strong moral values which have been passed on to me through education or religion, then I'm going to be less likely to act on that impulse. Whereas if I don't have those things, I will be more likely to. So it is kind of factoring in both sides of that, the wider society, but also my individual circumstances. And then we now need to look at the other factors, which are actually looking at the reaction to the crime. Why it is that maybe certain crimes get more of a reaction than others. The remaining 3 factors of consideration in the Taylor et al. Model are all focused on the reaction to the deviance as opposed to the act of deviance itself, therefore drawing a lot of inspiration from the interactionist view of crime and deviance. So the 4th factor is the immediate reaction to the deviance. We have to be able to understand why it is that the police may react one way on a particular day but then differently another. We have to understand why people are giving such an immediate reaction to a particular crime. We have to understand why, for example, a female committing a crime may be treated somewhat differently than a male committing the same crime, and likewise with classes. Why is it that a working class may receive a different treatment when compared to a middle class? We then have to consider the origins of the deviant reaction. What this means is the reaction of the actual deviant themselves to the social reaction. How people choose to react to the reaction of others to their behaviour is seen to be conditioned by two factors by radical criminology. The first is the individual's structural location in society, whether they are rich, poor, powerful, powerless, their social class, gender, etc., but also the individual's personal attributes, whether or not they are accepted into deviant subcultures, for example. The sixth factor is the outcome of the social reaction to the deviant's further action, essentially meaning if the deviant will respond to the social reaction that they receive by potentially committing more deviance. This idea originates from Lemmert's distinction between primary and secondary deviance that we looked at in the first few lessons of crime and deviance. Now, each of the factors that we've gone through need to be considered as a whole. They have to be seen as one overall theoretical explanation of deviance, basically divided into two parts: an understanding of the process whereby the deviant comes to see deviation as a solution or an option to act, but also an understanding of the process in which the agents of social control come to be involved in a process of criminalisation of that individual. So there are all the factors, basically kind of 1 to 3 being focused on the action, and then 4 to 6 being focused on the reaction. So you can kind of, if you wanted to really simplify it, break it down into two parts. That crime is caused by the individual circumstances of the action, shaped by the wider society, and then the reaction is also kind of shaped by the immediate reaction to that individual around them, so the reaction of families, those involved, and then the reaction of the wider society and all of the circumstances that surround that. So you can really start to think about how this theory is trying to be really ambitious. It's kind of really trying to go out there and just explain every single facet of every crime, trying to address a lot of the criticisms that we've made, a lot of the other theories about, how it ignores this and that. Radical criminology says, well, no, there's no need to ignore anything. Let's try and please everyone in our theory. But of course, no theory can necessarily go without criticism. So there are a few evaluations we have to go through as to why perhaps it doesn't meet this goal in its entirety. Finally, we just need to evaluate the concepts of radical criminology. As an advantage, it combines different perspectives and uses labelling theories within a Marxist framework, effectively combining two different theories and the best parts of each. But as disadvantages, it is often considered to be gender blind, focusing almost exclusively on male class-based crime. It makes some reference to gender difference in crime, but some theories like feminists would argue not enough. Burke Hopkins, in 2005, argued that it is both too general to actually explain any specific crime, too broad, but also too idealistic to be used in tackling crime. Its solutions of the wider criminalisation of the capitalist system, for example, just don't provide any practical solutions to criminal behaviour. And the same criticism would come from left realists, who argue that this kind of wide-scale social approach to understanding crime doesn't really provide any practical solutions on a day-to-day basis for those suffering from crime. It only offers some degree of explanation. So that's radical criminology, essentially. Trying to be everything to everyone, but of course there are a few kind of criticisms to be made that I've laid out. It's not going to be accepted by kind of die-hard Marxists who are essentially arguing that everything comes down to the economic system. Remember, that's the traditional Marxist view, that actually everything is shaped by the base structure of the economic system. But it doesn't also necessarily please interactionists either, because they would argue that crime is purely a social construct with very little motivation necessarily behind it. It doesn't necessarily please left realists either, because they would argue that it doesn't actually provide any radical or practical, I should say, solutions. all it does is basically try and make this big overarching theory, but it doesn't. It's so broad and so general, you could argue, as to be totally invaluable to anyone trying to think about any solutions to crime. I mean, imagine if you were trying to come up with a policy program for a government to combat crime, and this individual brings you the 7-factor, analysis of why crime is committed and stuff about the reaction and stuff. You wouldn't be necessarily be able to kind of comprehend that simplistically and able to make any serious practical solutions. You'd probably throw them out the door. So it really comes down to you as to whether or not you think this is the complex approach that it is, or whether it's actually just kind of an over-bloated theory that tries to please everyone and ends up pleasing no one.